Before I discuss other topics in my video today, I'm going to focus firstly and primarily on a series of three back-to-back videos published by my friend Gonzalo Lira. Now, in those videos, Gonzalo Lira, who has been out of sight since his arrest by the Ukrainian authorities in April, speaks about the fact that he has jumped bail in Ukraine, that he's decided that he will not attend the trial which has been prepared for him, which will begin in 2 days' time, and that he is in fact seeking to cross the border, the Ukrainian border, into Hungary, where he intends to claim political asylum. Gonzalo described a harrowing story. He's described how he was arrested, interrogated by the Ukrainian authorities, by the Ukrainian Counter-intelligence Agency, the SBU, how the SBU have accused him of what are in effect opinion crimes. It's been acknowledged by the Ukrainian authorities that he has not perpetrated any violence against any individual on Ukrainian territory, nor engaged in any property-related crime. His crime is purely the fact that he published certain opinion videos on YouTube. Now, before discussing, or perhaps more correctly, putting aside the question of whether those videos violate any Ukrainian law, and I've already in earlier broadcasts made clear my own deep skepticism and doubt about this indictment that has been brought against Gonzalo. Certainly, the videos do not disclose any military secrets, and they do not say anything that would, to my mind, in any way compromise Ukraine's war effort or its national security interests. But putting all that to one side, it is absolutely clear that the videos that Gonzalo is being prosecuted about are purely opinion pieces, and that this is therefore a political charge brought against Gonzalo for words which he has expressed. That is the totality of his crime. The second thing that Gonzalo says is that, well, he is very critical of the legal process through which he has been taken through, but he also says that whilst in prison, whilst in pre-trial detention, he was subject to repeated acts of violence, of beatings, and indeed other violent acts by prisoners, other prisoners in the detention center in which he was held, and that this happened without any interference from the guards of the prison, and that he believes that these prisoners who were molesting him, who were assaulting him, had either been put up to it by the Ukrainian authorities, and one prisoner apparently all but admitted as such to him, or in the alternative, that the prison authorities had been bribed by the prisoners who were carrying out these attacks to turn a blind eye to what they were doing. Now, let me reiterate again, well-established point, that the responsibility for the safety of anybody who is held in any place of detention rests with the authorities of that place of detention. Over the last 10 years or so, there has been a massive outcry in the West over the death in Russian custody of a man, Sergei Magnitsky, who allegedly received mistreatment whilst in a Russian prison. I say allegedly, though the Russians themselves admit that there were aspects of the fact about him that was held in custody where they were indeed at fault. Now, this seems to me to be, on its face, at least a comparable example, in some ways a much more serious example, because unlike in the Magnitsky case, where it was the whole issue revolved around fraud, this is, as I said, these acts of violence are being perpetrated in connection with what is, in all respects, a political prosecution. Now, the authorities in the West, the governments in the West, have been extremely critical of Russian actions over the Magnitsky affair. They've imposed sanctions, they've passed acts, so-called Magnitsky Acts, penalizing Russian officials supposedly involved in that affair. One would like to think that they're going to take the allegations of violence against Gonzalo at least as seriously. And the third thing that Gonzalo says is that he is at grave risk if he is caught by Ukraine and returned to the control of the Ukrainian authorities, of being first convicted on this political charge that has been brought against him, which seems, to all intents and purposes, judging by what he says, a foregone conclusion, but also of being sent to a prison camp, where, in light of his pre-existing medical condition, his prospects of survival are slim or perhaps non-existent. Now, I want to say straight away that all three of these facts, the fact that this is a political prosecution, the fact that Gonzalo himself says, and I believe him, that he has been subjected to acts of violence whilst in the detention of the Ukrainian authorities, and the threat to his life and well-being if he is imprisoned. All of these three things taken together, to my mind, conclusively establish a case for political asylum to be granted to him if and when he reaches the territory of the European Union. Now, he's hoping to do this in Hungary. He might, for all I know, find himself in other places. Can I say that freedom of speech is a civil right enshrined in Article 10 of the Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights. It is a protected right, in other words, exercised by all citizens, or individuals, incidentally, not just citizens, on the territory of the Union. And given the violence that has apparently been meted against him and the threats to his well-being and safety and potentially his life, it seems to me that the case for granting Gonzalo political asylum in the European Union is overwhelming. So if Gonzalo does indeed arrive in Hungary, I would urge everybody to make, especially in Europe, to make clear to the European authorities, to the authorities of their own countries, that they should support Gonzalo's request and not take any step to send him back to Ukraine. That's the first thing I wanted to say about this affair. The second is that, of course, if Gonzalo is captured or has been captured before he can cross the border and has been returned to the custody of the Ukrainian authorities, then it becomes even more important, given what he has told us, that Western governments, which hold considerable sway in Kiev, including first and foremost his own government, which is the government of the United States, take steps to ensure his safety and his return to his home countries, which are either the United States or Chile. It's quite clear that a person who is facing a political charge, who is subjected to violence in prison, and who is at risk of death or serious injury, if he remains where he is entitled to the protection of his own governments, Chile and first and foremost the United States, but also the support of the international community, first and foremost of the European Union, which is the primary supporter of Ukraine. Now, those are the key points I want to make. Let me reiterate again, the authorities both in the United States and in the European Union, in the various European Union countries, have shown a remarkable lack of public interest in Gonzalo's case. It may be therefore necessary to remind them of their moral and legal obligations to support him in this kind of situation, this extremely dangerous situation in which he now finds himself. And if Gonzalo does arrive in any European Union territory, including in Hungary, I would ask that the authorities of those countries obviously consider and grant his claim of asylum, and that the legal communities of those countries act to provide him with that level of protection as well. So that's what I wanted to say about this case. I have been seriously concerned for Gonzalo's safety for a very long time, and I will say that though it is good to see him alive, what he has had to say has alarmed me considerably, and it seems to me that he needs people's help and support more, even more, than has been the case up to now. I will now proceed to the rest of this program. Now, today's the 1st of August, which, in theory at least, means that we are now, calendarically speaking, in the 3rd month of Ukraine's counter-offensive. This is not actually strictly true in the sense that the offensive itself began on the 4th of June. So it will not be until Friday that we can say definitely that we are past the first 2 months of this offensive. But we are coming within days of that point, and I would repeat again what I said in my program tomorrow. Ukraine appears to be stuck in all the places where it has been attacking up to now. Now, just before I made this program, there were reports that the Ukrainians have launched another attack in the direction of Rabotino, this village south of Orekhov, which they've been trying to capture ever since the 4th of June, a village which lies some distance to the north of the major Russian fortified lines in this area, a village which, by the way, Ukraine wrongly claimed a couple of days ago that it had captured, and where the Ukrainians have also claimed that they've gained some ground close to this village, all of those claims being, as far as I can see, entirely untrue. Now, a Russian commentator, Yevgeny Belitsky, the governor of Zaporozhye region, the Russian-appointed governor of Zaporozhye region, I should make clear, he actually predicted earlier this morning that this attack would take place, and he said the following, and he said this on his Telegram channel. In the Orekhov area, the enemy, he means Ukraine, is regrouping trying to form assault teams from mobilized troops who lack training. The enemy's activities are poorly coordinated, morale is low, and there are numerous cases of surrender, as it is the only option for enemy troops to remain alive. Well, the last is perhaps going a bit far. It is clear that Ukrainian troops who do engage in these assaults do sometimes survive them, but it is undoubtedly the case that losses have been horrendous. And in fact, shortly before this program began, there were reports that there has in fact been an attack from Orechov towards Rabotino. This is what the Slavyangrad Telegram channel says, that the Ukrainian military continues to send waves of infantry to attack Russian positions along the Rabotino-Verbovoye line. The enemy's primary objective is to target the junction of our regiment's defences in the fields between Rabotino and Verbovoye, and the Ukrainian assault groups are facing fire over rough terrain and making landings without armoured vehicles, trying to break through to our trenches. These active infantry attacks have been ongoing since yesterday, since the 31st of July. Our howitzers and multiple launch rocket systems are providing covering fire against the advancing enemy units. The enemy has already suffered significant losses. Some units are demoralized and starting to retreat, but new assault groups are arriving from the landings. And that is a report which I found on Slavyangrad. I believe that it comes from another source, but it gives us some idea of fighting that is going on in this sector again. I'm going to say straight away that Ukraine has been banging its head, if you like, against Rabotino for weeks now. None of its attacks on Rabotino so far have been successful. Perhaps this one will be, but that report which I just read suggests otherwise. Now, whilst I'm on the subject of Orechov and Rabotino, I should say that one particular very senior Russian military official, no less a person than General Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Russia, and, by the way, the overall commander of Russian forces engaged in the conflict in Ukraine. He actually visited and inspected the troops in the area, and the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us both with a film of Gerasimov listening quietly to reports provided by senior Russian military officers in what looks like an underground bunker facility somewhere, which has been obviously kitted out for some command role. And it has also provided us with a very, very brief readout, which reads as follows. In the course of a visit to the Special Military Operations Zone, the Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, inspected a forward command post of the group of forces in Zaporozhye direction. At the forward command post, the Chief of General Staff was briefed by the group's commander, Colonel General Alexander Romanchuk, on the current situation, the nature of the enemy's actions, and the tasks Russian troops perform in the Orechovsky tactical direction. In the course of the inspection, General Gerasimov drew attention to timely detection of enemy troops, preventative strikes, and counter-battery warfare. So, there we go. That perhaps gives us an idea of how important the sector of the line, the sector south of Orechov, is. It's supposed to be the main axis of Ukraine's advance. They've been trying to break through the Russian lines here to press on towards the town of Tokmak, by the way, ringed with defensive belts, and then push south from Tokmak towards Melitopol and ultimately press on from Melitopol towards the Sea of Azov. That's the Ukrainian plan. Everybody has known it since the autumn of last year. It's been much discussed and talked about, and it can only succeed if the Ukrainians are able to break through the Russian front lines in this area and break through the various other lines that lie behind those front lines. Though for the moment, as I've said previously, the Ukrainians haven't managed to do that. They're still fighting to capture places like this deserted village, Rabotino. Anyway, we will see what happens, but up to now, attacks like this have not been terribly successful for Ukraine. And I would say that Belitsky is talking about the fact that Ukrainian assault forces in this area are now largely made up of recently called up and poorly trained reservists. If this is true, then it would reinforce the impression that Ukraine is doing one of either two things: trying to engage the Russians in some kind of attrition warfare in which it's prepared to sacrifice the lives of these reservists in order to deplete Russian defenses, which is a callous strategy, but I suppose it is a kind of strategy. Or alternatively, that the Ukrainians are trying generally to break through, but that they're running out of trained men, that most of the trained men that they had have either been killed or wounded, and that there's simply not enough of them any longer to go around. Now, it may be that the actual case of this is the latter, the second, because we have had another interesting explanation of the state of the conflict from the Russian Defense Minister, General Shoigu. And Shoigu, Sergei Shoigu, made certain comments about the state of the conflict yesterday at a meeting in the National Center for State Defense Control. This is the main, if you like, the hub of the Russian military. It's where planning goes, if you like. It's their war room, or rooms, in Moscow. Anyway, Shoigu attended a meeting there, and he made a number of observations about the state of the fighting. And he said the following: the command of the Ukrainian armed forces is desperately sending new troops into the assault on Russian positions. So he also appears to think that they're largely reservists. Thanks to a competently constructed defense, skillful organization of the fire system, professional actions, endurance and perseverance of the Russian servicemen, the enemy advance was prevented. Now, this was yesterday, so he's not covering the fighting today. He says a large-scale attempt by Ukrainian troops to break through Russian defenses was thwarted in the Orekhov direction. The units of the 810th Marine Brigade and the 71st Motorized Rifle Regiment showed fortitude and self-sacrifice. So I'd like to thank all of our guys again, all the guys, especially from these brigades, but from others too, because we have not seen such an onslaught yet, but in this case, everyone worked on that. For 2 days alone, 26th to 27th July, more than 400 Ukrainian servicemen, 31 tanks, so the number has increased from 21 to 22 to 40 to 31 tanks, including 3 German-manufactured Leopard 2s and 2 French-manufactured tanks, that's the AMX-10 RCs, as well as 32 armoured fighting vehicles were destroyed near Rabotino. A total of 63 armoured vehicles were destroyed. Now, it's gradually coming to be acknowledged that the fighting on the 26th and 27th of July, this so-called reboot of the offensive, which I've discussed previously on my programs and which my colleague Alex Christoforou and I have discussed on other programs on our main channel, the Duran, that this was the biggest, most intense attack that Ukraine has launched up to this point. And if you recall, that attack took place in concert with an article in the New York Times, which spoke about the fact that this was the main Ukrainian attack over the course of this offensive. And if Shoigu's numbers are correct, and I see no reason to doubt them, as I said, certainly the equipment losses have been corroborated when the Russians have made claims about Ukrainian equipment losses on other occasions. Anyway, the equipment losses are of such a scale that it would indeed be the worst defeat Ukraine has experienced since the offensive began. And the Russians claim that this attack was undertaken by 3 battalions of the Ukrainian military. I've said that this could be between 1,500 and 2,000 men in total, depending on the size of these battalions. Shoigu claims that 400 Ukrainian troops were taken out of action, in other words, were either killed or wounded. He uses the word destroyed, which might even suggest that they were killed. Well, that is around a quarter to a fifth of this entire force, which is a horrendous rate of loss by any measure. And Shoigu then went on to say that using maneuver, counterattacks and counterstrikes, Russian formations and military units have liberated from the Ukrainian troops Korvalyovka and Sergeyevka in the Krasny Liman direction, as well as Molchanovka railway station in Kupiansk. So they are advancing there. And then Shoigu goes on to give total losses that Ukraine has suffered over the month of July. And he says, over the past month, as a result of the successful actions of Russian troops, the enemy were up to 20,800 servicemen. To be precise, 2,824 men and 2,227 units of various weapons, including 10 Leopard tanks, 11 US-manufactured Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 40 US-manufactured M777 systems, and 50 self-propelled artillery systems from the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, France, and Poland. And it is obvious that the Western-manufactured arms supplied do not lead to successes on the battlefield, but only prolong the conflict. Now, these are horrendous losses. 20,000 men lost over the course of June. He says that 10 Leopard tanks have been lost, and bear in mind, the original batch supplied to Ukraine numbered 60. So that's a high proportion of these tanks. So as I've said in the past, it may be that some have been recovered and repaired and will be sent back into the battle. He says 11 Bradleys have been destroyed, which is fewer than I would have expected based on the photographic and film evidence, but nonetheless, it does suggest that Bradley infantry fighting vehicles are being lost as well. But then look what he says about Ukrainian artillery losses. 90 artillery pieces lost over the course of July, 40 M777s, and 50 self-propelled guns supplied by Britain, the United States, Germany, France, and Poland. 90 guns in total. Now, there's some uncertainty about the total number of Western guns which have been supplied to Ukraine, but I've seen figures of around 300 to 400. This is a significant proportion of that total. And I doubt, by the way, that these can be brought back into a state of repair. Now, my colleague Brian Baletic, in an outstanding video which he did yesterday, has spoken about the misconception that lay behind the rebooted offensive that Ukraine launched on the 26th and 27th of July. And this was that it seems that based on inaccurate or misconceived counts, the Ukrainians and the West believed that through effective counter-battery fire and perhaps through depletion of Russian ammunition stocks, Ukraine has now achieved some kind of predominance in artillery. There is no evidence that this is the case. All the evidence, on the contrary, suggests that it is the Russians who continue to retain overwhelming artillery superiority across the entire front line. But note that Shoigu is saying that in reality, it is Ukraine that is taking huge losses in terms of artillery assets. 90 up to 90 US supplied artillery pieces, Western supplied artillery pieces, M777 howitzers, 50 self-propelled guns have been destroyed over the course of this offensive. So we get a sense of the level of failure at the present time. Now, whilst on the topic of artillery, there's been another article in the Financial Times, and it reads, US faces hurdles in ramping up munition supplies for Ukraine war effort. And the article goes on to say, I'm not going to read it in full, it's behind the paywall, but it says that the United States has probably supplied to Ukraine every single 155 millimeter shell that it has produced over the last 10 years. It's still aiming to increase production of artillery shells to 155 millimeter artillery shells to 90,000 a month by 2025. It's currently producing around 30,000 shells a month, but this is against the 8,000 shells a month that Ukraine is using. So even if the United States is able to produce 90,000 shells a month by sometime in 2025, about which one senses that the author of this article is more than a little skeptical, even if it manages that, it's only producing around 10 days expenditure of these shells by Ukraine at current usage. So there is a clear crisis. The article confirms that the reason why the United States has supplied cluster munitions to Ukraine is because of the extent to which numbers of shells have been depleted, stocks both in both in Ukraine and in the United States, have all but run out. And we have this very interesting admission by Jake Sullivan, made last month, that's to say in January, at the Aspen Security Forum, of which I was unaware, in which he said that I personally, this is Jake Sullivan speaking, sit in my office every morning and spent 30 minutes on 155 millimeter ammunition, trying to find some ways, somewhere, somehow, some means of pulling together shells to send to Ukraine to keep the war going. One could sense the crisis that is developing, and the artillery crisis in particular, which could prove decisive in ending this war. Now, my friend Brian Beletic, I just want to say again, has been months ahead of everybody that I know of in discussing this issue. It's fascinating to see how the admissions have just gradually built up in the mainstream media on this issue. They've gradually come round to acknowledging the truth of what he was saying long ago. And of course, by contrast, all the indications are that the Russians for the moment continue to be fully supplied with ammunition. Anyway, all of this goes along in conjunction with a series of increasingly pessimistic articles. Now, I spent a long time discussing various articles yesterday. There have been some more, and I'm going to just touch on them because they do now start to show an increasing darkening of the mood in the West about the prospects of this offensive. And we start with an article in the New York Times, and I should say both of these articles are about the fighting in Staromayorsk, this little village on the Vremevka ledge. Actually, it's also such a little village. It's 839 people. So a big village, but a deserted village, and a village nonetheless, which Ukraine claimed to have captured on Thursday, but which the Russians say they have actually launched a counterattack in that village, and that they've pushed the Ukrainians out, and the village is now essentially deserted and unoccupied by either army, and according to the Russians is in the grey zone, which, by the way, I believe to be true. Anyway, we have an article in the New York Times, amid the counterattack's deadly slog, a glimmer of success for Ukraine. And we're then told by the New York Times recapturing the village of Staromayorsk was such welcome news for the country. Remember, this is a village of 839 people, that President Volodymyr Zelensky announced it himself. But formidable Russian defenses have stymied progress elsewhere. And then we go on to read, for 10 days, Ukrainian Marines fought street by street and house by house to recapture the southeastern village of Staromayorsk, navigating artillery fire, airstrikes, and hundreds of Russian troops. The Russians put up a ferocious defense. Now, remember all that talk about a demoralized, disorganized Russian army? Well, those disorganized, demoralized Russian troops are putting up a ferocious defense, apparently. And then we go on to read that as officials celebrated Ukraine's progress in Staromayorsk, troops elsewhere said on the ground that the Russian defenses and firepower remained formidable and in places impassable. A soldier at a medical post awaiting evacuation for a concussion recently described how his battalion had been decimated when it came under Russian artillery and tank fire. His brigade, the 23rd, was one of 9 newly formed Western-trained units prepared and equipped for the counter-offensive. But the brigade, he said, had been thrown into the fight without sufficient artillery support and had been unable to defend themselves against Russian firepower. In one battle in which his unit took part, Ukrainian soldiers attacked in 10 American Max Pro armoured vehicles, but only one came back. He showed photographs of the damaged vehicles, ripped open and burnt out, which he said had been hauled back to a repair base. The soldier declined to give his name for fear of getting into trouble with his superiors. The soldier lost a friend, Stas, in the shelling before, he adding that in just 1 month, his battalion suffered so many dead and wounded that only 10 men remained at the front line. 10 men out of a battalion, perhaps 4 to 500 men. This from one of those elite Western-trained brigades that we've been hearing so much about. And that's losses of one battalion in that brigade. Who knows what the other battalions have gone through. And then another soldier, Oleksiy, says that we were shot like on a shooting range. A drone was flying above us and correcting the artillery fire, and their positions were in former Russian positions hemmed in by minefields, and the Russians were able to keep them pinned down and under constant drone surveillance. Soldiers were running out of ammunition and water, but could only sneak in and out of their positions in 1 or 2s on foot when the light was poor, just before dawn and dusk. And we then go on to read that interviews with Ukrainian soldiers and a review of military surveillance footage from a recent attack indicate that many Ukrainian units are sustaining heavy losses. And we then hear of a group that was deployed to storm Russian positions in a village on the western part of the front, most probably Pyatikhatki, though the village is not named. The soldier says that this unit took such heavy casualties in 4 days of assaults that they had to be pulled out without success. And as after their armoured vehicles were largely destroyed by artillery strikes on the first day, they revised their plan and approached the village on foot through a tree line that had been mined. The Ukrainians cleared a narrow path with demining explosives, and the first soldiers reached the Russian positions and dropped down into the trench. And then it turned out that the trenches were mined, and there were explosions, and the trenches were mined, said the assault commander. Our guys started jumping in the trenches and blowing up. The Russians were watching, and they detonated the mines. And then we go on to read, several weeks later, the village remains in Russian hands, and those who managed to avoid the mines came under attack from multiple Russian kamikaze drones. It seemed like they had a drone for each person. The amount of equipment the Russians have, had we known, it was like Mission Impossible. So that's what Ukrainian soldiers are telling the New York Times about the reality of this offensive. And then we have another report, this time, interestingly, from Reuters. And this again describes the Battle of Staromayorsk. And it says that the troops at the spearhead of Ukraine's counteroffensive, this is Reuters, British news agency, consistently takes an extremely pro-Ukrainian position. And it always takes the most optimistic view of how well Ukraine is doing on the battlefield. Troops at the spearhead of Ukraine's counteroffensive say a battle last week along the front in the southeast proved to be tougher and bloodier than expected, with plans going awry and an enemy that was well prepared. The Russians were waiting for us, said a 29-year-old soldier using the call sign Bulat from a unit sent into battle in armoured vehicles during last week's fighting. And they fired anti-tank weapons and grenade launchers at us. My vehicle drove over an anti-tank mine, but everything was okay. The vehicle took a hit and everyone was alive. We dismounted and ran towards the cover, because the most important is to find cover and then move on. Our mission was planned to take 2 days, but we couldn't drive in during the darkness at the right time. So we drove in later and lost the right moment. And then we hear about how the Russians had months to prepare their fortifications, and so minefields. The Ukrainian attackers lack air superiority, and Russian defenders had set up pre-sighted zones in anticipation of the attack. They methodically destroyed the roads. They made pits that prevented driving in and out of the village, even in dry weather. Every walking was quite hard. You can't use flashlights at night, but you still have to advance. And another soldier said the men in his unit tried our best. We made it. The dismount was not great. We advanced slowly but surely. They were shooting. Everything was flying. It was scary, but we moved on. Nobody fell back. Many of us who went will never return home. And all of this for Staromayorsk, which of course the Ukrainians claim to have captured on Thursday, but which most probably is back in the grey zone. So that gives us some idea of the nature of the fighting. By the way, one of the reasons, I think, why that New York Times report didn't identify the village on the western end of the front line, which the Ukrainians were unable to capture, but which I believe to be Piatichatki, is because, of course, Ukraine has actually previously claimed to have captured Piatichatki, and there were reports to that effect in the Western media. Admitting that Piatichatki has not been captured by Ukraine would be admitting that earlier reports of the capture of Piatichatki were untrue, and perhaps the New York Times editors decided that that wasn't something that they wanted to happen. So there we are. We see what the reality of this offensive is. Now, many people come and criticize the fact that I so often read Western reports of the fighting in Ukraine. Well, the reason I do that is because, of course, if you go to the things that the Russians are saying, you go to Russian telegram channels or to Russian newspapers like Redovka, or you go to the Russian news agency TASS, the official news agency TASS, you will find essentially the same accounts of the fighting, the same claims about Ukraine suffering these devastating losses, about tanks and artillery and belonging to Ukraine being destroyed, about Ukrainian infantry being killed in colossal numbers. But of course, if it comes from the Russians, people will always come back and say, well, that's just the Russians. Of course, they're giving that kind of spin on what is going on in the fighting. Let me repeat, these two articles that I read today, one came from the New York Times, the other came from Reuters. Hardly pro-Russian media entities, and yet they give us this harrowing account of this offensive. And to reiterate again, in no part of the front line have the Ukrainians managed to break through to the main Russian defense lines. All this fighting continues to be in the zone of control, and there is no sign of that breakthrough, that elusive breakthrough through the front lines, which we are being told, constantly being told, needs to happen. So, where are we? Well, Shoigu, over the course of his address to the military headquarters in Moscow, he spoke about the continued Russian advances in the north, in the Kupiansk and Liman, Krasny Liman area, and towards the Oskol River. And I suspect that if this advance continues, and it seems Ukraine is finding it increasingly difficult to pull together forces to stop this advance, even though, as I said previously, I get the impression that for the moment, Russian forces in this area are not huge. Anyway, it could be that if this advance continues, if an important place like Kupiansk is actually captured by the Russians, well, that will be the final moment when it will become impossible any longer to deny the truth that Ukraine's offensive is failing, that the Russians are currently dominating the battlefield. That is what all of these reports tell us. Notice the Ukrainian soldier, for example, who said, who could have imagined that the Russians had so much equipment? They seem to have a drone to monitor what each Ukrainian soldier is doing. Who could have believed it, that they had all of these things? Well, if you've been listening to Brian Baletic's programs, if you'd come to the Duran, if you'd read Alex Vashinin's pieces from last year, you probably would have known it. But most people perhaps don't know it. And obviously, people in Ukraine didn't know it either. But anyway, the Russians are dominating the battlefields for the moment. They're advancing in the north, and they're holding the Ukrainians, and they're grinding them down. Now, Ukraine is not idle. It's tried to launch missile and drone strikes. It tried to launch more seaborne drones to attack 2 Russian surveillance ships. One of them, again, was the Ivan Kotov. The Russians say that all 3 of those drones were destroyed by those ships. These attacks have not been particularly successful. I should say that these seaborne drones, which Ukraine has been using, have not been particularly effective weapons. The only damage they've ever managed to do was in that one attack on the Crimean bridge. And I suspect that the barriers that the Russians are creating will prevent any more attacks of that kind from taking place. And I quite agree with those, by the way, who complain that those barriers should have been put up earlier. But anyway, that's another issue. But anyway, they tried to attack those 2 surveillance ships. They've also sent drones to attack Moscow. And it's now becoming clear that this is becoming a central obsession for Ukraine. They can't, for the moment at least, break through on the front lines. There is some evidence that their reserves are becoming depleted. They're running out of ammunition, and they're running out of trained men, and they're having to throw in untrained men to make up the numbers. And this is putting perhaps a finite time to how their offensive can continue. So it is important for them to give the impression that they're continuing the war and that they're not out, they've not been knocked out, and they do what they always do in these situations. Attacks on Crimea, where the air defenses have become increasingly dense, are becoming increasingly difficult. So you relocate, you refocus on the other soft target, which is Moscow. And there are reports in the media that Ukraine is now frantically trying to put together a large enough drone force to attack Moscow in significant numbers. And it would be Moscow, at least Russia. And President Zelensky, whose government had previously pretended that they were not directly involved in drone attacks on Russia, is now openly talking about Ukraine's determination to take the battle to the enemy. And the United States looks on, and they don't seem especially bothered. In fact, one senses that they're quietly supporting this, as well as their hopes for the offensive are fading away. So, drone attacks on Moscow. Now, to the best sense that I can understand, the drone attacks appear to be targeting the Russian Defense Ministry, at least for the moment. They are not getting through. They're either getting shot down or they're being brought down by electronic jamming. Many of them, two of them at least, have fallen in the area of the Moscow Business Center. This is a relatively confined area. It's got some skyscrapers there, modern skyscrapers. It was built a couple of years ago. To my mind, doing nothing good to Moscow's skyline, by the way, but it was built as a business center to attract business people and to develop Russia's financial services industries. I should say that architecturally I don't like it, but anyway, that's irrelevant to this discussion. The fact is that these drones have been trying to reach the Defense Ministry. They're being brought down near the Moscow Business Center, and they're doing superficial damage. And if you see the buildings of this business center, which are huge, not as huge as those you will find in the financial centers in London and New York, which function on a completely different scale to the one in Moscow. The one in Moscow is very small by comparison. But anyway, these are big buildings, and a falling drone can smash out a few windows and cause a certain amount of damage, but they're not going to cause any damage that will seriously alarm the Russian authorities. These are pinprick attacks, and even if Ukraine is able to step them up, build and produce more drones, it's difficult to see how they can penetrate through to Moscow's defenses and do really serious damage in the capital, given that the capital is well defended and given that we're talking about a city of, at a minimum, 12 million people, probably many, many more than that. These are pinprick attacks. The only thing they do, in my opinion, is harden the mood in Russia, convince the Russians that Ukraine is a terrorist country and should therefore be defeated entirely, explaining why so many Russian men are apparently now volunteering to join the army and to participate in this military operation. So that's what these attacks do. Now, of course, I could be wrong. It could be that Ukraine finds some magic key and say is able to deploy 100 or even 1,000 drones against Moscow, and they manage to break through and do some damage, just do some real damage. Again, that isn't going to change anything in the war. Moscow, however big a city, however important a city, is one city in Russia. This is a huge country, vast country, the biggest country in the world, it cannot be attacked in every place by drones. Most of the Russian population will be unaffected. The most that will happen is that they will be angered by these attacks on their nation's capital, and that anger will probably strengthen the Kremlin in its resolve instead of weakening it. And it's strange to me that people both in Kiev and in the West don't get this point. But anyway, there we go. Now, I'm going to return briefly to the topic of that program, of that conference, that peace conference that's taking place in Jeddah. And we discussed it, my colleague and I, Alex Christoforou, on the Duran in a dedicated video. And Alex made what I think is a completely correct point. He said that this conference was clearly set up following the earlier conference in Copenhagen. It was clearly set up to coincide with Ukraine's offensive. Presumably, the expectation was, when this conference was first mooted, that by this point the Ukrainians would have broken through and would be moving towards Melitopol or Mariupol, in any event, the Sea of Azov. And the hope was, because it's clear now that it was the United States, Jake Sullivan to be precise, who is the mastermind behind this conference, even if they managed to persuade the Saudis to host it. The idea was to hold this conference against a backdrop of Ukrainian military success and Russian military defeat, and to try to get Global South countries and BRICS countries like India, Brazil, and the others to come round to the American point of view and to put the pressure on the Russians and on Putin to accept defeat, not to try to reverse the outcome of the offensive, and to negotiate an end to the war on American terms, which are essentially President Zelensky's terms, which are that the Russians stage a comprehensive pullout from every single square centimetre of post-1991 Ukraine, including Crimea. Well, that, of course, was predicated on the offensive succeeding, or at least achieving some success. The reality is that the offensive is not succeeding. In fact, all the indications are that it is failing. And unless, again, the situation changes radically within the next couple of days, that is going to put both the United States, which is going to be represented by no less a person than Jake Sullivan, and the Ukrainians in an extremely awkward position when this meeting begins to take place. One can easily see how the Global South countries will simply come back and say that the United States, Ukraine, are not being realistic in their demands. They're obviously failing on the battlefield, and it is unrealistic to think that they can achieve on the diplomatic table that which they have failed to achieve in actual fighting on the battlefield. Anyway, that is how it looks to me. Now, Maria Zakharova, the spokesman of Russia's foreign ministry, has, however, endorsed the point that I made in my video yesterday, that the Saudis will probably try to use this conference, where they are technically the hosts, to try to get the Ukrainians especially, and the Americans perhaps, to be more realistic about their position. And of course, the failure of the offensive, if it is still the case, when the conference convenes on the 6th of August, will of course make the work for the Saudis easier. So it could be that this conference ends up doing the opposite of what Jake Sullivan perhaps hoped. Instead of enabling the United States to exert diplomatic pressure on Moscow in conjunction with military pressure achieved by a breakthrough on the battlefronts by Ukraine, what it's going to end up doing is reversing the situation, creating a situation where, on the contrary, it is Ukraine and the United States that come under pressure to compromise. And we'll see how they respond to that. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the conflict in Ukraine. Now, there is potentially another conflict brewing, and that is in West Africa. It is clear that the coup in Niger is creating major concern in the West. France and Italy are at the present time evacuating their nationals from Niger. The government of Niger has retaliated or responded by saying that they're suspending deliveries of uranium to France, which would be a critical situation for France. There remains the possibility of a military intervention by Nigeria and the ECOWAS group of African states, and Mali and Burkina Faso, which have previously had coups and which appear to be supporting the coup in Niger, are threatening that if a military intervention of that nature does occur in Niger, they will treat that as a declaration of war, in which case we could very well end up seeing a major crisis, an all-out conflict in West Africa. Now, I'm not an expert in this region, and I hope that cooler heads prevail. I'm going to say this: whatever one's feelings about the coup and the coup plotters, and indeed the ousted president, it's clear that the coup leaders do have some degree of popular support, as shown by the protests that are taking place in the capital of Niger. And however important Niger was in the grand strategic picture of the Western position in West Africa, ultimately any government in Niger is going to have to deal with the West. I mean, Niger needs to sell its uranium to someone, and it's highly likely that if this affair is played out calmly, that it will resume uranium sales to France and to the West. The only reason to be panicked about this event is if you are one of those people, neocons and their like, who see everything, every single event in the world, as a move on the great chessboard, and who see the coup in Niger as a lost piece, as representing a lost piece or a lost square in the Western game on that chessboard. As I have repeatedly said, I think this is a fundamentally fallacious way of looking at international relations. Each country, every country, has to work its way through its own future, live, if you like, through its own, what will become eventually its own history, find its own way, make its mistakes, come to whatever ultimate arrangements that suit it best. Nobody should act in a way that threatens anyone else by entering, shall we say, dangerous alliances. That is a guaranteed way to spread wars. But there is no reason to panic, because internationally, in Paris or London or Washington, because there is a political crisis in Niger, the thing to do is to respond calmly, to let the situation take its course, to try to avoid violence, certainly to avoid intervening in that country in a way that might cause the situation to spiral out of control, to keep the situation stable, and to remember that the priority, above all, is to preserve peace and to seek the best welfare of the people of Niger. Will the governments of France, Italy, which is now also apparently involved, and of course the United States, heed that counsel? Will the government of Nigeria do so? Well, that remains to be seen. Unfortunately, and this is the truth, whenever there is a temptation to intervene in any particular country, Western countries at least never seem to resist that temptation and end up doing it with disastrous consequences, in part for themselves, but principally, of course, for those people who they say they're going to save. Anyway, this is where I end my program today. May I wish you all a good day. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop, buy yourself the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. Also, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.